What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 36 Dynasty wide receiver rankings. Also going to be including rookies here, so kind of showing how this current draft class fits into the current wide receiver landscape for Dynasty. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Who are you higher on? Who are you lower on? If you enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. But let's just dive right into the rankings here. We're going to start off in tier 1. I have 3 wide receivers in this tier. I have Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, and Justin Jefferson. I don't think anyone would argue with Chase Jefferson being in this top tier. Jamar Chase, coming off a wide receiver 1 season, nearly hit 24 points per game, extended with the Bengals, tied to Joe Burrow for the foreseeable future. So he obviously belongs here. He's my wide receiver 1. For Justin Jefferson, he's my wide receiver 3, not necessarily coming off as insane of a season in 2024, but he's been a top 5 wide receiver in points per game in each of the last 4 seasons. So the consistency's there, and I think with the right quarterback situation, if J.J. McCarthy hits, he also has that upside, very similar to Jamar Chase. And then for Malik Neighbors, obviously hasn't logged like one of those nuclear seasons, but as a rookie in a bad situation with bad quarterback play, he was still able to finish as the wide receiver 6 in points per game. He's also like 3.5 to 4 years younger than Chase and Justin Jefferson, so he still has a few years to kind of get his situation figured out before, you're really like banking on him hitting those monster seasons. Then moving into tier 2, I think there's going to be some variance within the tier. I think, the guys in this grouping, probably not super controversial. I'm leading off this tier with Puka Nacua as my wide receiver 4. Going to be turning 24 years old this offseason, so still very young. Last season, had a great season when you're looking at the 11-game sample size. When you actually lock it into the 9 full games he played in, so taking out the week 1 injury game where he left early, and then week 9 where he was ejected, in the 9 full games, he averaged 21.8 PPR points per game, and that was on only 3 touchdowns in those 9 and 11 games. So he didn't hit in the touchdown department, and he was still giving you that high-end wide receiver 1 production. Stafford re-upped with the Rams this offseason, so at least in the short term, he's going to have that strong quarterback play. I think he's still somewhat underrated. Maybe it still goes back to the fact that he wasn't an elite prospect, and so people don't treat his insane production the same way. But if we just forget our priors and we look at what Puka has done in the NFL in his first couple of seasons, he totally belongs up here, in tier 2, and I have him leading this tier. My wide receiver 5 is going to be someone heading into their second season, and that is Brian Thomas Jr., only 22 years old, was the wide receiver 12 in points per game as a rookie. And that's a great number by itself, a wide receiver 1 in your first season, but he absolutely closed the season on a tear. In his last 6 games, he averaged 22.9 points per game, was targeted at least 10 times in all 6 of those games, and then also went for at least 85 yards in all 6 of them. And that was with Mac Jones at quarterback. You have Liam Cohen coming in as the head coach. I love that fit with the Jaguars. He did great things with the Bucs last year. You have Trevor Lawrence, who I'm still a believer in. I think this is a great situation for BTJ. I think this offense is going to run through him, and I think he's going to be a top-tier Dynasty wide receiver for years to come. After BTJ, going to go with CeeDee Lamb here as my wide receiver 6. A little bit older than the other 2 guys in this tier. He's going to be turning 26 this offseason, but he's been very consistent over the last few years, 17-plus points per game in each of the last 3 seasons. We know he has that elite upside, peaked at 23.7 points per game in 2023, also attached to strong quarterback play with Dak Prescott. I think CeeDee Lamb firmly belongs here in tier 2. And then my last guy in this tier, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, 25 years old. He's been 4th in points per game in back-to-back seasons at 20.7 and 18.6 points per game, tied to solid quarterback play in Jared Goff. I don't know if he has the same type of upside as a guy like CeeDee Lamb or Jamar Chase. Even within this tier, I don't know if his upside is there with BTJ, even Puka, but, wide receiver 4 back-to-back, you're obviously going to take that, just kind of showing why I might not have him up at wide receiver 4 or 5, like some other rankings lists might have, but I'm on Ross St. Brown, still in tier 2. Now shifting into tier 3, the guy I have here at number 8 is Nico Collins, and I kind of feel like he belongs in a tier right between 2 and 3, almost in his own one-man tier. I'd feel like he'd be a little bit below the guys in tier 2, but I do think he's a little bit ahead of the guys we have here in tier 3. He's had 17-plus points per game in back-to-back seasons. He is going to be CJ Stroud's clear-cut wide receiver 1 moving forward. And when we look at his start to the season, before he had, I think it was a hamstring injury, he was an absolute monster. 6 for 117, 8 for 135 and a touchdown, 4 for 86, and then 12 for 151 and a touchdown. If this Texans team can get their offensive line situated, I do think he has like that 20 plus point per game upside, someone who could be competing for the wide receiver 1 overall spot. Did kind of break out a little bit later into his NFL career, so he's 26 years old, but you're still expecting like 4 or 5, really strong wide receiver 1 seasons moving forward. My wide receiver 9 is going to be Drake London, and he finally had some at least like decent quarterback play in 2024, finished as the wide receiver 13 in points per game. Now, Kirk Cousins came in, really didn't play all that great. When Michael Penix, kind of took over as the starting quarterback, Drake London had some nice performances. In the 3 games with Penix, he went 5 for 59, 7 for 106, and then 10 for 187 and 2 touchdowns. I do think we could see Drake London take another leap heading into year 4. I do think he has the ability to be a mid to potentially high-end wide receiver 1, in any given year. And I do think we could take that leap in year 4. Then my wide receiver 10 is going to be Ladd McConkey, 23 years old, just like Drake London. Really solid rookie season. Honestly, just a great rookie class at the wide receiver position. A lot of these dudes balled out. Ladd McConkey was the wide receiver 16 in points per game. In his last 7 games, he averaged 18.7 points per game and went for at least 80 yards in 6 of those 7. This was also on an offense that was pretty low volume in terms of their passing attack. They had the 5th fewest pass attempts per game in the NFL, and he was still balling out. Now, I've talked about this. I think the Chargers could still add another weapon. Maybe they spend like a round 1, round 2, round 3 pick, whether it's on a tight end, potential wide receiver. I do think that could be in the cards. This is still a very weak wide receiver room outside of Ladd McConkey, but the talent's there. He's attached to Justin Herbert. I think he's going to be an absolute stud moving forward. After Ladd, I'm going to have JSN as my wide receiver 11, just recently turned 23 years old. Another guy who kind of had a nice end to the season. His last 9 games averaged 18.2 points per game. This offense did just have like a major shakeup. The offensive coordinator has been changed. You have a quarterback change going from Geno to Sam Darnold. You have DK Metcalf gone, Tyler Lockett gone. You have Cooper Kupp coming in. I talked about this in my redraft wide receiver rankings where I don't really love the fit of JSN and Kupp playing together. It seems like you're kind of sacrificing the skill set of one of those guys because, only one of them can actually be in the slot. So, you hope they use him to, his optimal ability. But I think at worst case, it's a short-term, problem, right? He's 23 years old. He's going to be a nice wide receiver option for a very, very long time. Another young wide receiver here, my wide receiver 12, we have Marvin Harrison Jr., only 22 years old. And he's kind of the first guy here where we haven't necessarily seen it yet in the NFL. He kind of had an underwhelming rookie season, especially in a year where you had Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr. both be fantasy wide receiver 1s as rookies. You had Ladd McConkey, who was a really nice wide receiver 2 play. He was underwhelming, 11.6 points per game, 62 receptions, 885 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns. Now, I do think this is not some sort of catastrophically bad rookie year. There are certainly, signs here that he can build, still be a really nice option at the wide receiver position, but it's also not great, right? He was considered to be this top tier prospect, had a pretty decent landing spot in year 1. It's not like the draft class where you had Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Chris Olave, all going to terrible situations. Pre-draft, post-draft, I thought the landing spot with the Cardinals, getting to play with Kyler would be a plus, a well above average landing spot than what you're normally dealing with, towards the beginning of drafts. Way better landing spot than going to Daniel Jones with the Giants, which is what Malik Neighbors did, and he produced. But I still think he was a great prospect. I think he can take a year 2 leap, but I know some people are kind of just penciling in that he's still going to be this amazing option, ranking him ahead of a guy like JSN or ahead of a guy like Ladd McConkey. And maybe after the 2025 season, I will have him ahead of those guys. I just have a really tough time, specifically with Ladd, where they were in the same draft class. Ladd McConkey had this amazing season, is in an amazing situation. I just have a tough time ranking someone who kind of disappointed ahead of Ladd, which is why I have Marv here as my wide receiver 12. And then my last guy in tier 3 is going to be Garrett Wilson, 24 years old, has had 3 pretty solid seasons, especially given the circumstances, 1,000+ yards in each of his first 3 years. 2024 put up 14.8 points per game. It was solid. Honestly, the Aaron Rodgers thing with the Jets, kind of an overall bummer, right? Because we didn't get him the first season where he tore the Achilles. And then the next year, him and Garrett Wilson weren't really clicking. it seems like Garrett Wilson's starting to get peppered with targets. He's putting together strong performances. And then they trade for Devontae Adams, and Garrett Wilson kind of gets bumped down to that wide receiver 2 spot. He just has not been blessed with like great quarterback play, playing in a great offense. And the future quarterback situation is still kind of underwhelming. Like they went out, they're bringing in Justin Fields. Now, I'm not going to be making the argument that this is like some sort of amazing situation here for Garrett Wilson. I'd say that having Justin Fields at quarterback is probably well below average in terms of like, someone supporting fantasy wide receivers. But I also don't think it's a death sentence. Like DJ Moore had his best fantasy season playing with Justin Fields. So I still think he's going to be solid, probably going to be like a wide receiver 2 fantasy-wise heading into the 2025 season. But he's still young. Quarterback situations can change, but in the short term, he's not set up like some of these other dudes, Marv with Kyler, JSN, at least you're getting Sam Darnold, Ladd McConkey with Herbert, London with Penix, Nico Collins with Stroud. He just doesn't have the same luxury at the quarterback position. Next tier, going to be tier 4. We're going to start it off here with T. Higgins, coming off a career season, wide receiver 5 with 18.5 points per game. In 12 games, he went 73 for 911, 10 touchdowns. He got extended by the Bengals, going to be attached to Joe Burrow. Maybe his peak ceiling is capped playing with Jamar Chase. Chase is obviously going to be the wide receiver 1, but he proved that even operating as the number 2, he can still deliver a mid-tier wide receiver 1 season. Still has a lot of, strong seasons ahead of him here. Like him at the top of tier 4. Wide receiver 15, going to have A.J. Brown, probably a little bit lower on him than consensus. I think in terms of his talent, like he's a better player than me having him ranked here wide receiver 15. I just feel like we know what we're getting with him in this Eagles offense. 3 seasons with Philadelphia, he has put up 17.6, 17, and 16.7 PPR points per game. He just doesn't have that upside, and he's going to be 28 years old by the time next season starts. So, T. Higgins has that capped upside, playing as a wide receiver 2, but he's been able to deliver mid-tier wide receiver 1 production in that situation. A.J. Brown, it seems like he's probably going to be hovering around like that back-end wide receiver 1 area. Could he have a boom season and give you like 18.5 points per game? Sure, but just like some of the other guys in this tier, I do think his upside is kind of capped. And then actually the third and final guy in this tier, it's going to be my first rookie. This is where I have Tet McMillan, 21 years old, going to be 22 years old, heading into the 2025 season. At this point, it does seem like the draft capital is a little bit up in the air. If he went top 10, I wouldn't be shocked. If he went between like pick 10 and 20, wouldn't be shocked. If he was somehow in like that early 20 range, like the wide receivers we saw, I think 2 years ago, that also wouldn't be shocking. I do just like him. He's a big, productive wide receiver. Statistically, from an analytics perspective, he's a really nice prospect, has great ball skills, and then you're just hoping for a nice landing spot. I've seen the Jaguars thrown out there. I think being able to slide in as the wide receiver 2, behind BTJ would be a fun spot. Chargers would also be super interesting. I've seen that mocked. Obviously, those are 2 very different spots of the draft, but he does seem like he has that ranging, just potential of where he could go. So he's going to wrap up this tier 4 area. Maybe some people think this is high, but you're looking at a guy who's like 4 or 5 years younger than these other guys, T. Higgins, A.J. Brown. So you're taking some risk because you don't know if he's going to hit. But if he is going to hit, I think he could be given production in the range of these guys and obviously for a longer period of time. Now, kicking off tier 5, I'm going to have Rashee Rice, who is going to be 25 years old heading into next season. I think he's a pretty interesting player to rank. I think some people are going to be much higher on him. Some people probably a little bit lower. He had a very impressive ending to his rookie season and then started out the 2024 season on a tear. In his 3 healthy games, he went 7 for 103, 5 for 75 and a touchdown, and then 12 for 110 and a touchdown. Like, it truly looked like he was going to be a league-winning option for fantasy, someone who was drafted in like the 4th, 5th, maybe even 6th, 7th round on more casual platforms. He was absolutely balling out, ends up tearing his LCL. Is he going to be ready for week 1? I think the hope is that he would be good to go, but there's never any guarantee with that. Also could have a potential suspension looming, which is interesting. And I think that's, something that maybe holds me back from ranking him higher because you have another young wide receiver there in Xavier Worthy, who's also kind of gotten into his own issues this offseason. But you're in this spot where if Rashee Rice is getting suspended to start the season, you're just really opening the door for Xavier Worthy to kind of break in, earn a larger role. And even if Rashee Rice is, still producing when he gets back, he might not have that same role that he would have, if he's just starting off the season. So the suspension definitely kind of sucks for him. He also is just an older prospect. So some of these other guys heading into year 2 are going to be like 21, 22 years old. He is going to be 25, heading into year 3. So he is up there in age a little bit, but still going to have him leading this tier. My wide receiver 18, Rome Odunze, heading into year 2, coming off an underwhelming rookie season, 54 receptions, 734 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. I just think I have so much more optimism with Ben Johnson coming in. Like, I was a believer in the guys they have on this team: Caleb Williams, Rome Odunze, DJ Moore. I just feel like Ben Johnson is going to pretty much optimize everything here. They've upgraded the offensive line. Odunze is still very young, 22 years old. He's a top 10 pick, was picked there for a reason. Pretty much everyone viewed him as a top 10 guy. So Rome Odunze, I think he's going to have a nice year 2 breakout. I think Caleb's going to take that leap, and I think Rome Odunze will follow suit. And then the final guy I have in this tier is going to be Rashee Rice's teammate, Xavier Worthy, who, just like Rashee Rice in his rookie season, Xavier Worthy had a really strong close to the year. In his last 3 regular season games, he put up 19.6, 20.5, and 22.9 PPR points. In the playoffs, he went 5 for 45, 6 for 85 and a touchdown, and then 8 for 157 and 2 touchdowns. Obviously, he's tied to, arguably the best quarterback in the league in Patrick Mahomes. And so even if Rashee Rice is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 and really stamps that in 2025, I still think Worthy is a talented player. Think he's going to have a strong role here. And as long as Mahomes is the quarterback, this is going to be an offense you want to be attached to. So Xavier Worthy will be in my top 20. Now, moving into tier 6, we're actually going to talk about my second rookie here. And this is where I have Travis Hunter. Now, I've started to get higher and higher on Travis Hunter as we start to become a little bit more aware on his potential landing spots, and then also how those teams view him, whether they view him as primarily a corner or if they view him more as a wide receiver. And he would be my wide receiver 1 in this class if we knew that was his position. If he did not play defense at all, he would be my clear-cut wide receiver 1, and he would be ranked much higher. And at this point, it seemed like his 2 most likely landing spots are with the Browns and with the Patriots. And the Browns had come out, I think it was around the combine time, and said that they view him more as a wide receiver than as a cornerback. So one of those potential landing spots probably is going to have him playing primarily wide receiver. And then there have been recent reports that, the Patriots are very interested in him with the 4 spot, and that they think he would be more of a wide receiver than on defense. So if you're drafting Travis Hunter for fantasy, that's obviously what you want to be hearing here. I just think he has so much potential, and if he is primarily playing on the offensive side of the ball, I think wide receiver 20 is going to be a steal. Obviously, you just have to factor in the risk of him splitting time or primarily playing defense, which would, make him way less playable on the offensive side of the ball. I think people are going to be all over the place on him. So wide receiver 20 is where I slot in. I doubt there's going to be a ton of consensus there, whether you have him higher or lower. My wide receiver 21 is going to be DJ Moore, and I actually kind of moved him up last minute here. I think we're getting into this interesting range of wide receivers where a lot of the guys in this tier kind of have that capped up side where maybe you're hoping for back end wide receiver 1 production. More realistically, you're just hoping they deliver you a bunch of solid wide receiver 2 seasons. And DJ Moore, even though he's going to be older than some of the other guys in this range, I think he has a little bit more upside. As we saw in 2023, put up nearly 17 points per game, was the wide receiver 9 in points per game. 2024, kind of stepped back a little bit, 14 points per game, wide receiver 26. Like I talked about with Rome Odunze, I am excited for this fit with Ben Johnson. I think we could see him have a career year with Caleb Williams. If he's putting up nearly 17 points per game with Justin Fields in a not-so-great offense, I do think he can improve on that, with Caleb Williams and Ben Johnson calling plays. So he's going to be my wide receiver 21. Like I said, a few years older than some of the other guys here, but I still think he has a lot of juice left in the tank and just a little bit more upside. My wide receiver 22 is going to be my 3rd rookie wide receiver. It is Emeka Egbuka. He's another guy where wasn't sure if I should rank him, lower than this. Probably wouldn't move him up any higher than this, but he's one of the guys where I don't know if he has the craziest ceiling in terms of his upside for fantasy, but I also feel like he is a very, very high floor prospect. So I would be pretty shocked if Egbuka was just not a guy. I think he has a very high chance of being a fantasy wide receiver 3 and more likely than not, like a solid yearly wide receiver 2 option. He produced next to elite wide receivers at Ohio State. I think he can be a target hog out of the slot, and I think he's going to get that round 1 capital, but I also think he's going to be in that sweet spot where he's probably going back end of round 1, where you're landing on good offenses with strong quarterback play. I think it's an interesting discussion when you're comparing him to some guys who I'm also going to have in this tier, like Jordan Addison, where he's going to be a year or two younger than Addison. Obviously not guaranteed to be a hit as a player, but also not pinned behind a guy like Justin Jefferson. Like, could he go to a not so great situation? Sure, but he could also go to a better spot where he had the opportunity to be a lead wide receiver right away, like Ladd McConkey going to the Chargers. You have a Devonta Smith who's going to be 3-4 years older than him, but probably more likely to deliver like those back end wide receiver 1 season. So it's really like an upside versus like age perspective. You're going to have Egbuka for longer, but he's obviously not a guaranteed hit at this point. I am pretty high on him. He's my wide receiver 22. Wide receiver 23, someone who's also pretty tough to rank, and it's just for injury reasons. I have Chris Olave here. So he's 24 years old, year 1 as a rookie in a bad situation, averaged over 13 points per game. Then year 2, also in a bad situation, 14.5 points per game. So he has produced, as a young player on bad offenses. The issue is that he has had 4 concussions in the NFL, and then he was also documented having 1 at Ohio State. So he's in this weird spot where, like, if he had no concussion issues, he would be way higher than this. Like, you could be making the case he's in that same tier with Garrett Wilson. Maybe if you don't think he's that high, like, I think the lowest he would be tier 4 if he didn't have these health concerns. But you're also potentially drafting or rostering a player where 1 more concussion and all of a sudden he's like stepping away from football. Like, it could be that serious of a spot. And he's also like just not getting random concussions. Like, the dude's getting put out cold on the field, which is never a great sign. And typically that can happen more and more. Once your light goes out once, it can happen more consistently. So talent-wise should be higher, but we're kind of just balancing the injury risk here with Chris Olave. My wide receiver 24 is going to be Jordan Addison. Was the wide receiver 30 in points per game as a rookie, wide receiver 22 in year 2. He's someone who I think is going to be able to give you like these consistent back-end wide receiver 2 seasons. Like I talked about earlier on, the issue is just the limited ceiling attached to Justin Jefferson, never going to be the wide receiver 1 on this team. And I think he's probably like peaking as like a Devonta Smith type playing behind like an AJ Brown. So could he at some point deliver you like a wide receiver 10, wide receiver 11 season? Sure. JJ McCarthy hits. This offense has a boom year. Sure, they could support 2, wide receiver 1s, but expecting him to be a mid-tier wide receiver 1 or better is probably wishful thinking at this point, at least in his current situation. Then right behind him, we do have Devonta Smith, 26 years old, a very, very good wide receiver, just also with capped upside. 2022, he averaged 15 points per game, was the wide receiver 14. 2023, 14.2 points per game, wide receiver 20. 2024, 15.3 points per game, wide receiver 15. So could he peak, have a wide receiver 10, 11, 12 season? Sure, but more likely than not, you're just kind of banking on like mid to high end wide receiver 2 production, which is fine, but it's not really moving the needle a ton in terms of like giving you a ton of upside, a ton of winning value for fantasy. He's a totally fine, nice option to have on your team, but like I said, the upside is kind of capped. And then the last guy in this tier, kind of falling into a similar spot, we have Zay Flowers. Back-to-back seasons in like the 12 to 13 point per game area, mid-tier wide receiver 3 production. He's attached to a lower volume passing attack, hasn't been insanely efficient so far in the NFL, and then is also not someone who's emerged as like a top tier target earner, especially on an offense that's not going to be throwing, towards the top of the league. So young player, 24 years old, kind of in a similar boat with some of these other guys. Then moving into tier 7, we're going to start off with Jalen Waddle, and I actually moved him up a decent amount right before I recorded this video. I think I originally was a little bit too harsh on him because he's coming off a really rough season. 2024, like the dude averaged 10 points per game and it was pretty much like phased out of the offense. Like you had Jonnu Smith, Devon Achane more involved as pass catchers than Jalen Waddle, which is shocking, but I did have to kind of remind myself how I felt about him, even heading into the season, his production in his first 3 seasons, what I thought his future outlook could be. Because you look at his first 3 years, 15.4, 15.3, 14.2 points per game. Like he was very much in those like Devonta Smith, T. Higgins discussions where it's like you have these wide receiver 2s on good passing attacks, you're hoping for like back end wide receiver 1 production, more realistically, mid to high end wide receiver 2 numbers. Like Jalen Waddle was with those guys. And what I thought was interesting for Jalen Waddle was like in the short term, the ceiling's not going to be there. But as Tyreek Hill starts to age, starts to fall off a little bit, Jalen Waddle is someone who could step up and kind of take over that role and really could have that mid to high end wide receiver 1 upside. And it's just kind of unfortunate that maybe as we're seeing Tyreek Hill start to slip, didn't have a great season, all of a sudden Jalen Waddle is like not a focal point of the offense. So I would be betting on a bounce back season here for Jalen Waddle, but it's also tough to see him going from like 10 points per game to all of a sudden like taking the mantle from Tyreek Hill as the wide receiver 1 on this roster. After Jalen Waddle, I'm going to have 2 more rookies here in Luther Burden and Matthew Golden. Have these guys back to back at this point. For Luther Burden, he's a fun player, great with the ball in his hands. You're hoping for like late round 1 draft capital. Also possible he's going sometime early day 2. Concerns about winning down the field, kind of needs to be schemed up. That was an issue his junior year. They didn't really use him correctly. Could be a concern in the NFL, but teams also always need guys who can just get the ball and make plays, and that is Luther Burden. Then with Matthew Golden here, he has definitely gained a lot of hype since the combine, smashed the 40 time, has the potential to be the first wide receiver off the board. I'm not quite that high on him, but still someone who like right out of the gate, I'd consider to be a top 30 dynasty wide receiver. Then I'm going to be going with George Pickens as my wide receiver 30, 24 years old, still very young. I think he has some interesting upside, but the future outlook just with the Steelers team is not great. In his first 2 seasons, he has put up 12.3, 11.7 points per game. So back-to-back seasons where he's given you like back-end wide receiver 3 production, not great. You can see the flashes, you can see where the upside could be, but the Steelers have just been consistently mediocre, and like their quarterback situation is in a rough spot. Like you're hoping Aaron Rodgers comes in and chooses the Steelers and signs with them, but it's possible that if Rodgers turns them down, you could be looking at a Mason Rudolph week 1 starting quarterback situation, which would be awful. They also brought in DK Metcalf, which now you're competing with a legit, solid wide receiver 1 option with terrible quarterback play. That's not great in the short term. I still think it's possible they trade Pickens. Like that was my initial reaction to them signing DK, was like, all right, they're probably going to move on from Pickens. That could obviously open up, some fun landing spots. But as of right now, tough to get too excited about his current situation with the Steelers. Then I'm going to have Jameson Williams as my wide receiver 31. Had a really nice year 3 breakout. Was the wide receiver 23 at 14.2 points per game. Super efficient on his opportunities, 5th in yards per target, 6th in yards per reception. I think in terms of like his archetype as a player, I don't know if he's ever going to have a ton of upside. It's like a top 12 fantasy guy, especially playing with Amon-Ra St. Brown, but I think he can be a nice wide receiver 2, higher end wide receiver 3. If he's hitting the touchdowns, the big plays, definitely a nice option in your lineup. And then the last guy I have in this tier is going to be DK Metcalf. I acknowledge I'm going to be much lower on Metcalf than consensus. I think he might be one of the more overvalued guys in Dynasty and in redraft right now. Like he's 27 years old, just got traded to the Steelers, which like I talked about, not looking like a great landing spot at all. And I feel like no one is getting more hype from 2020 than DK Metcalf. He's had like one amazing year for fantasy where he put up 17 points per game, was the wide receiver 10 in points per game. And since then, the production has just not been there. 14.4, 13.3, 14.1, 12.8 points per game. Since 2020, his best finish is wide receiver 20 in points per game. And so he's older than a lot of these other guys. He's heading to a bad situation. I have a tough time ranking him higher than this. Like if I think I can get back-end wide receiver 2 production from a Jameson Williams, he's 3 years younger. I prefer him. I think in a different situation, I could get that out of Pickens. He's also 3 years younger. I'd rather take a shot on these rookies, Luther Burden, Matthew Golden, kind of what I talked about earlier, like that back-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 production. It's not making or breaking your fantasy team, and so I'm willing to kind of roll the dice on some younger, more unproven guys who could have that potential upside. Now, maybe they somehow pull off a miracle at quarterback and this ends up turning into a great situation, but when you're kind of getting higher up there in age, you just have less of a time frame for the team to actually figure it out. And I also don't have a ton of confidence that the Steelers are ever just going to like tank to actually be in a situation to get a legit quarterback. Seems like they're fine just hanging around 500 and not really having a legit answer there. So that's going to wrap up tier 7. And then my final tier here, my wide receiver 33 is going to be Josh Downs. I am very high on Josh Downs, only 23 years old. In his second season, put up 13.1 points per game. The wide receiver 28 on a very, very bad passing attack. Bad situation here with the Colts with Anthony Richardson, Joe Flacco at quarterback. He commands targets at a high level, was 6th in target rate. And I just think he has a very, very bright future. Contrary to a guy like DK Metcalf, who doesn't have a ton of time ahead of him, for that quarterback situation to get figured out. Things could change quickly here for the Colts, even if he has to deal with a bad situation in 2025. If Richardson doesn't pan out, they could easily be on to someone else, a more interesting option for Josh Downs, as soon as 2026. So I just like the player, young, flashed in year 2 in a not so great situation, someone I want to bet on moving forward. Then I have Jerry Jeudy, going to be turning 26 this offseason, coming off a really impressive 2024. 90 receptions for over 1,200 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. He was 6th in the NFL in receiving yards. One potential concern here is that his splits with and without Jameis were pretty extreme. In 7 games with Jameis Winston at quarterback, Jeudy averaged 21.2 points per game. Without Jameis Winston, he was at 9.3. Now, one thing in favor of Jeudy is that he does have another fantasy season in 2022 where he was a top 20 wide receiver, the wide receiver 19 in fantasy. So it's not like, someone maybe like a Cedric Tillman who like his only good career NFL games came with Jameis Winston. But we also have, real question marks here for the future quarterback situation for the Browns. So good that he flashed a solid season, but in terms of the future outlook, just a lot up in the air in terms of him as a player and his offensive situation. At wide receiver 35, I have Brandon Ayuk, 27 years old, coming off a torn ACL. When we're looking at his first 4 seasons, he had 3 wide receiver 2 finishes, putting up 15.4, 13.4, and 15.6 points per game. Deebo Samuel is gone. They paid him to be their wide receiver 1. And so as long as he can get healthy, I think he could have, 3 solid seasons of strong wide receiver 2 production, with the upside of potentially like breaking into like that back end wide receiver 1 area. But obviously there's no guarantee he's the same guy first year off the ACL, but still going to be a top weapon here for the Niners on an offense that I still think is going to be solid. And then my wide receiver 36, this final spot could have gone to a few different guys. I will have some honorable mentions that I'll just kind of quickly mention. I went with Terry McLaurin. I think he has the nice combination of like great situation, a win now player, but still realistically has like 2, 3, maybe 4 years of relevant production ahead of him. Coming off a career fantasy season, 15.8 points per game, was the wide receiver 14. He was top 10 in touchdowns, deep targets, air yard share. You do have Deebo Samuel coming in, so they're, upgrading the wide receiver room. I still expect him to be the top dog there. And then just some honorable mentions here. Guys like, veterans, Tyreek Hill, Mike Evans. For guys like that, it's just tough because what you're projecting them to be maybe fringe wide receiver 1s heading into this year, and they could really just like fall off a cliff at any point. Some of these other guys, a Brandon Ayuk, Jerry Jeudy, I think they could get back to that fringe wide receiver 1 area, and they're just going to have a lot more years to do it. Jaden Reed is like the one like younger honorable mention, maybe a Ricky Pearsall if he breaks out. Chris Godwin coming off a torn ACL could also be in the mix. And I think Devontae Adams, like I'm going to be pretty high on Devontae Adams heading into this year, but it's like 1, maybe 2 seasons of strong production, and then, you're expecting a pretty legit fall off. But that's going to wrap it up for my top 36. Would love to hear your thoughts, obviously based on how your team is constructed, whether you're tanking, win now. You're going to take different players, but that's kind of what the tiers are for. But thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.